Natalie. Thank you for joining us. So you were finance minister of the Ukraine until a very, very short time ago. A couple months you've been out of office. And what's interesting about your career is you actually grew up in Chicago, and your parents were Ukrainian. Your father escaped or was the victim of a Nazi death camp, right? Explain that.
My parents immigrated during World War II, kind of caught between the communists on one side and the Nazis on the other, ended up in displaced persons camps. Think back to the last migrant crisis in Europe, and then were lucky enough, blessed, to be able to immigrate to the United States at that time, rather than being sent back to the Soviet Union.
And I assume they infused a great love of the Ukraine with you growing up, since you ended up.
They did, a great love of Ukraine and a great love of the principles that stand behind the United States. And in essence, I kind of grew up with this John F. Kennedy perspective, which is ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And I lived that, I tried to live that, tried to infuse my children with that every day.
So you spent a lot of time in private equity in the Ukraine, so it wasn't a place that was new to you when you were asked to take this position a couple of years ago. Nevertheless, it was a time of revolution, it was a time of Russia's new aggression, and it was a time of an economy that was teetering on collapse. I mean, it was a mess. Tell us about your decision to take the post of finance minister when it was offered to you.
So I had indeed lived there for 20 years, both with some U.S. government experience, the first 3 years at the embassy, and then 20 years managing $600 million of private equity funds. And when the president came to me about 8 months after our revolution, or our Maidan, Revolution of Dignity, the country was indeed facing financial collapse. We had had the illegal annexation of Crimea and the illegal occupation of our eastern part of our country, some 7% of our territory, 20% of the economy destroyed. We were in free fall. And when he asked me to be Minister of Finance, I was surprised, to say the least. I kind of sat with my two daughters.
Who had grown up there, so it wasn't too new to them. They'd lived through all of this.
They lived through 2 revolutions and a war. I tried to explain to them the choices that I had to make, and while I was explaining to them that men were being taken off to the front, men were volunteering for the front, gentlemen weren't coming home to their wives, their children, their families, because they were saving us from potentially further invasion, I realized that there was no choice but to act and to do what I could do for the country at that very difficult time. And so in that conversation with my girls, I in essence made my decision to serve.
So one of the big issues facing you, of course, is corruption. And somebody described this as, the criminal posturing in the Ukraine is a way of doing business. How did you tackle that?
Good thing I was from Chicago. I think at the time we were there, we spent kind of 3 different tools of trying to reduce and turn corruption around. The first was getting rid of the privileges and preferences that individual businesses or monopolies had in the economy. That happened through tax policy, by changing railway tariffs. Anything that was benefiting one particular vested interest group, we tried to reverse. We got rid of all the middlemen in our gas trade. For 2 decades, there was always someone in between the buyer and the seller of natural gas making billions and billions of dollars on the back of the state. We no longer have any intermediaries in our trade.
You must have faced enormous resistance.
Yes.
I mean, give us an example.
I'm no longer in government.
Yeah.
The second way was to eliminate the space for corruption. So basically, using e-procurement, using e-data, putting our treasury online in real time, which most European countries haven't even done yet, giving civil society the tools to fight corruption, the knowledge.
So that cash wasn't flowing through the system.
Exactly.
Is that to take that out?
And then the third part, creating institutions. We have a new national police force, which truly protects and serves. We have a National Anti-Corruption Bureau. The final part is the part that's missing and continues to be the challenge, which is judiciary reform. In the end, you need to be able to have a system that gives a reasonably fair trial and puts people behind bars for crimes committed. And that's the part that's just recently started with constitutional reform moving forward.
So you ended up working with a couple of key women in the world global finance system. Penny Pritzker, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, who has a history going back to Kiev, and Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, both of whom have been on our MPW stage. Both are good friends of ours. Tell us about those alliances and how that might have helped you.
They are very, very important, and there are many others. Christine Lagarde being the head of the IMF at a time when my country had to borrow the largest IMF program in the history of its institution, her decision-making was critical. She also was a great mentor for me at a time when I was being asked to be prime minister just a couple months ago by my own president, asking if I would serve. And sometimes, especially at a time of war with the largest nation next door, the largest standing army in Europe, I worried about whether or not I would be able to succeed as a prime minister. And she gave me great advice personally. And
Which was what?
To basically grab the girl by the hair and just try my best, establish that I could do it, and then let history take its course. History did take its course, and I'm not the prime minister, but I tried, yeah. and I worked through that, and I developed a government. I developed principles under which I would govern, which were very clear: no to corruption, no to vested interests, absolute movement forward on the IMF agreement and on our European Union deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, which were things that the people of Ukraine had basically died for during the revolution. European values, European principles, the right to be free, the right to have a competitive economy, the right to have free media, freedom of assembly. So they were very, very important for me, but I think also for the Ukrainian people. So she gave me the strength to kind of just move forward with it, regardless of whether or not I had, and anyone in that position would have doubts. But to leave the doubts behind for a moment, and as I think yesterday was said on stage, courage enables courage, and she really gave me that. Penny Pritzker is from Chicago, and her roots are in Ukraine, so we share a whole very interesting background. And with Penny, I think what's really critical is that she's a very hands-on business person, and our economy needed investors more than ever to be able to enable job growth, to be able to enable growth in general, economic growth. And she just, she's a whirlwind. She just convinces people one by one. She is very, very convincing with both government officials on the other side of the table. She's very clear about what kinds of changes investors, businesses need. So I think that no jokes, take no prisoners approach works very well for her, and I think it worked somewhat for me as well.
So you came in and had to, and you're an outsider, even though you're somewhat of an insider, trying to institute reform in a country that has a long tradition of being, shall we say, less than reformist when it comes to rule of law, corruption, and so forth. Talk about, because I think this resonates with anybody coming into a large institution and trying to reform, talk about lessons learned on trying to create change.
I think the number one principle is that you never will have enough time. People are very desirous of the success of your reforms, but they're not really interested in living through the difficulty of your change. And it's the same in a corporation as it is in a country. Yeah. So they want all the benefits of it, and they're very impatient with the process of getting there. So to the extent that you can make that process faster, you need to always understand you will never have enough time. And so you need to move as quickly as possible with the transformation. At the same time, when you're looking at an economy, I think a large part of it is that the IMF, and as a finance minister, I was very focused on fiscal policy, on inflation, on debt. But the average citizen wants to know what's in it for me. And so as you're doing this macroeconomic financial stability, which is absolutely critical, and you can't do without it, you need to have in parallel a process of providing for schools, hospitals, roads, things that everyday people can feel and can understand. My life is getting better, my child's life will be better, my parents, I'll be all right when they go to the hospital. And I think if you can provide that balance between, yes, the macroeconomic fiscal sustainability, but also those things that people really want in their everyday lives, you might have more time politically before the populists get up on their heels and start saying, this is too painful, you should have free gas, natural gas should be free, it comes out of the ground, it's yours. Those kinds of things resonate in many countries. We're seeing it in the United States, we're seeing it in many other countries. That populism is very simple. There's simple 40-word tweet answers to the most complex problems. And if you haven't given people the assurance that their lives are getting better, that they can see and feel, not just because you have reduced inflation or a reduced fiscal deficit, we did that. But what's the difference to the average citizen that your fiscal deficit is not 10.1% of GDP, but 2.2% of GDP? That's critical, but it's not important to them. So Those are my two, I think, biggest lessons learned. One, you never have enough time, so move as quickly as possible. But two, you have to provide for the people something that they can feel aside from the statistics and the very critical fiscal parts.
And the other lesson of this is that Twitter feeds simplistic populism, which is a really interesting insight. We have time for one question while I tee up this question. What did you achieve and what's left? And describe your roadblocks a little bit more to achieving what you did.
I think we saved the country from a financial collapse. I'll be frank, our currency was fluctuating between 20 and 40 to the dollar in one day. You can imagine what happens to your average citizens, let alone business, when you can't have any predictability in currency. We have a currency that's stable now. We've moved from basically an empty central bank reserves of less than 1 month's import coverage to 3.5 months or $13.5 billion. We've got a budget now where we pay all our wages and all our pensions. When I came into government in December of 2014, we had to pick and choose which coal miners would strike first, which ones we could give a couple weeks' pay to, because the previous regime that fled the country after the revolution left the country with the equivalent of about $100,000, $110,000 for a country of 45 million people. And we're spending 5% of our budget on, 5% of our GDP on the defense of the country, which has to be a priority at a time of invasion. But we stopped the Russian forces. We stopped the invasion in its tracks. It's a fragile ceasefire. So I think we've stabilized the economy. We've stopped the invasion. We have a fragile ceasefire. Hopefully it'll get better. Hopefully fewer people will die. But we're now challenged with almost 2 million internally displaced people in our country that have come from the east or from Crimea. The indigenous Tatars are being forced out of their homeland in Crimea. And we have enormous challenges ahead of us to continue the path of fighting corruption, to reintegrate these 2 million people into our society, and then to bring our economy out of what's been a recession that's lasted years. We recently had the first month of industrial production growth after 42 months of continuous decline. So I think we've turned the corner. I think we've bottomed out. And I think now the question is, how do we grow? And it's either exports or investment, and hopefully it'll be both.
One very quick question. Okay, because we're on a short time frame here, I want to ask you, what are the prospects that you'll go back into the government and help them continue to move forward?
Well, I think I would consider if I was asked again. I decided at this point to take a small break. I didn't join the new government. I wanted to re-energize. I wanted to take a step back and look at the lessons learned and how we might improve the process going forward. I wanted to also show young people, in particular young women, which are a very, very strong component of the leadership of both business and government, that you can serve even if you're not in government, even if you don't buy into the governmental machine. And so I've launched Aspen Institute Kyiv, which is a platform for dialogue, for policy development, and I'm hoping to launch another foundation to focus on veterans and internally displaced people. So I want to show that there are many ways to serve your country.
And your message to the businesswomen in this room about Ukraine and investment in Ukraine now? 93%
of our country is at peace. We have the most cost-efficient platform for manufacturing and for export to the European Union after our deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. And it is extraordinarily well-talented, highly educated. It is a place for outsourcing. I've spoken to several of you who have outsourcing businesses there, helping your businesses. So come take a look. I'm happy to help anyone with entering the market.
Well, Natalie, thank you so much. And you'll be here during the break for more people to talk to. Thank you so much.
Thank you.